The room smelled like old wood polish and her perfume. That lavender one she'd worn my entire life. Standing in the doorway of the funeral home, I could smell it and I almost couldn't breathe. My aunt touched my elbow. "You came," she whispered. I nodded. I didn't trust my voice yet. What I didn't tell her, what I hadn't told anyone except my husband, was that I'd spent 3 days sitting with this decision. 3 days staring at the ceiling of our apartment in Vancouver, turning it over and over. My mother was gone. She'd been gone for 4 days before anyone even called me. 4 days? My cousin had texted, not called. Thought you should know. Service is Saturday. That was the entire message. I want to back up because if I don't explain where I started, none of what happened at that service will make any sense. I grew up in a small town about 2 hours east of Calgary. The kind of place where everyone knows your father's name, and your father's name means something. My father. I'll call him my father, because that's the biological fact of it. Nothing more. Was a well-regarded man in that town. Municipal contractor. Coached minor hockey for 15 years. On the board of the local credit union. He had firm handshakes and a loud laugh and people genuinely liked him. At home, he was a different equation entirely. I don't need to catalog everything. What matters for the story is what happened when I was 17. I'd gotten a partial scholarship to an arts program at a university in British Columbia, a real one. Not huge money, but enough to signal that someone outside our town had looked at my work and said, yes, this. I was so proud. I came home with the letter and put it on the kitchen table like an offering. My father read it, set it down, and told me that if I left for that program, I shouldn't expect to come back. I thought he was postuling. I thought he was doing that thing he did, the threat designed to make you fold. To make you say, okay, you're right, I'll stay. I'd watched my mother fold under those threats my entire childhood. I'd watched her make herself smaller and smaller until she barely took up space in her own house. I didn't fold. I left 2 weeks later with a duffel bag and $300 I'd saved from waitressing. He didn't drive me to the bus station. My mother stood at the front door and watched me walk down the driveway. She didn't wave. I kept waiting for her to wave and she didn't, and I carried that image with me for 11 years. The first winter in Vancouver was brutal in ways that had nothing to do with weather. I couch-surfed. I worked 2 jobs alongside my program. There was a period of about 6 weeks where my living situation was genuinely uncertain, and I ate a lot of instant noodles and didn't tell anyone from school because I was too proud and too scared. I got through it. Slowly, then all at once, the way these things tend to go. I got through it. By the time I was 25, I had a small but real career in graphic design. By 28, I had clients I was proud of, a 1-bedroom apartment I paid for myself, and a person in my life who would eventually become my husband. His name is Elliot. He's quiet in the way that competent people sometimes are. He doesn't need to fill a room with noise because he's too busy actually paying attention to things. We met at a friend's dinner party. He asked me one question about my work and then actually listened to the answer, which at the time felt almost radical. We've been together 6 years, married for 2. What Elliot does for work, I'll get to that. It matters, but not yet. I had not spoken to my father in 11 years. My mother and I had a complicated, fragile thing. Occasional emails, a phone call maybe twice a year, always careful, always with the awareness that she was still in that house and I was not allowed to be the reason things got harder for her. I understood, mostly. I grieved it, also. The 2 things coexisted. Then she got sick. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed 18 months before she died. She told me herself over the phone, her voice completely steady in that way she'd trained it to be. I offered to come. She said not yet. I called every week. Sometimes she answered, sometimes she didn't. 4 months before she died, the call stopped connecting. I found out later my father had gotten her a new phone. And then my cousin's text. Thought you should know. Service is Saturday. Elliot was sitting across from me when I read it. He watched my face and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, do you want to go? I said I didn't know. He said, I'll come with you either way. I thought about my mother standing at that door. Not waving, I thought about her voice on the phone, steady and careful. I thought about 11 years of emails that always ended with, take care of yourself. Sweetheart her way, I think, of saying things she couldn't say directly. I thought about the fact that I never got to sit beside her hospital bed. I never got to hold her hand at the end. Someone made sure of that, and it wasn't her. I told Elliot I wanted to go. I want to be honest about something. I was not walking into that service as a grieving daughter only. I was also walking in as a woman who had done 11 years of therapy and knew a father was. I had documentation. I had a lawyer. I had spent the better part of the previous year quietly, methodically preparing for the possibility of exactly this: my mother's estate, what she'd intended, what my father might try to do. My mother had a small life insurance policy, not large, around $60,000. She'd taken it out years before I left, when she was still working part-time at the dental office. I was the named beneficiary. I only found this out because her oldest friend, a woman I'll call her friend, because that's what she was, one of the only real ones my mother had quietly gotten a message to me 3 weeks earlier. Your mother wanted you to have it. The paperwork is in her name at Sun Life. Don't let him tell you otherwise. My father knew about the policy. Of course he did. And in the weeks since my mother's diagnosis had turned terminal, he'd been doing what controlling men do when they feel something slipping. He'd been tightening his grip. He'd told family members I'd abandoned her. He'd told people in town I cut off contact years ago for no reason. He was building a version of the story where I was the villain and he was the abandoned husband, and he'd had 11 years of uncontested narrative space to build it in. I was about to walk into a room full of people who believed his version. Elliot squeezed my hand in the parking lot. He was wearing a dark gray suit, and he looked calm, in a way that I was trying to mirror. Ready? He said. No, I said. Let's go anyway. The funeral home was a heritage building on the main street. The kind of place that's been handling small town grief for 3 generations. Inside, the air was close and warm and smelled of lilies and that lavender. I recognized faces I hadn't seen in over a decade. Some of them looked at me with open surprise, a few with something colder. My aunt, my mother's sister, the only person on that side who'd maintained any real contact with me, found me within the first 2 minutes. She held my hands and her eyes were red, and we didn't need to say much. She knew what it had cost me to be there. My father was across the room. He looked older. The hair that had been dark when I was a teenager was almost fully gray now, and he was heavier, but the posture was the same. That way he had of standing like he owned whatever floor he was standing on. He saw me and I watched his face do something complicated. Surprise. Then a kind of recalibration. Then something that looked almost like a smile. He walked toward me. I prepared for this. I want to be clear about that. I had rehearsed in therapy and in my own head exactly what it would feel like to be in a room with him again. And I had decided who I was going to be. I was going to be steady. I was going to be polite and absolutely unmovable. He stopped about 2 feet away. You actually came, he said. His voice was the same. That particular register, warm on the surface, testing underneath. She was my mother, I said. He looked at Elliot. Who's this? My husband. Something shifted in his expression. He extended a hand to Elliot in that automatic way he had. The firm handshake reflex. Elliot shook it and said nothing beyond a neutral hello. My father turned back to me. He said very quietly, so the people nearby couldn't quite hear. You shouldn't be here. This is a family matter. I said, I am family. He said, you stopped being that when you walked out. I had known he would say something like this. I had known it. And still, standing there in the room where my mother's coffin was, it landed somewhere in my chest. I took one breath. Then I said, I'm here for the service. I'm going to say goodbye to my mother. And then I'm going to speak to the executor of her estate. That last part. The way his face changed when I said that. It was the first crack. He stepped closer. There's nothing to discuss. Everything is handled. I'm sure you believe that, I said. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said something I won't repeat in full, but the gist of it was that I was not welcome, that I had no claim to anything, and that if I had any sense, I would attend the service, keep my mouth shut, and leave. I nodded once, like I was taking that under consideration. Then I walked past him to take my seat. The service was beautiful, actually. The officiant had known my mother through her church and spoke about her in ways that were real and specific. Her garden, the way she brought food to anyone in the neighborhood who was sick, the quilting group she joined in her 50s. I cried. I hadn't expected how completely I would fall apart in that pew, but I did, quietly, with Elliot's hand in mine. I was crying for more than her death. I was crying for the visits I didn't get to have, for the phone calls that stopped connecting, for the 17-year-old version of me walking down that driveway, and for every year after that I'd waited for something to shift. I was crying for my mother, who I believed had loved me in the quiet, limited way that was all she'd ever been allowed to give. When the service ended and people began moving toward the reception, my father appeared at my shoulder. He had someone with him. A man I didn't recognize. Tall, younger than my father, wearing an expression that I can only describe as professionally sympathetic. My father introduced him as a family friend in a way that made very clear he was something more functional than that. "I think it would be best if you didn't stay for the reception," my father said. His voice was still quiet. Still that surface warmth. "Out of respect for the family." "I am the family," I said. For the second time, the man with him, the family friend, said something about it being a difficult day for everyone, and perhaps it was better to let things settle before any conversations. I looked at him. I said, "Are you the estate executor?" He glanced at my father. "I'm here in a support capacity. Then I don't need to speak to you right now," I said. My father's voice dropped even lower. "You don't have anything in writing. You don't have anything at all. Whatever she may have told you, she wasn't well at the end. Her judgment was impaired. Everyone here will say the same." I thought about the Sun Life policy number I had memorized. I thought about the letter from my mother's friend that was photographed and stored in 3 separate places. I thought about the 18 months of documentation I had quietly assembled with my lawyer in Vancouver. I said, "I think we have different understandings of what I have." His face went flat. "Leave?" "No." That one syllable. I'd been practicing it for 11 years, really. The first time I'd ever said it cleanly, without apology, without softening. What happened next happened quickly. My father turned to the room. There were maybe 30 people within earshot, and said, in a voice now carrying, that I had shown up after 11 years of abandoning my mother to cause problems, and that he was asking me to respect his grief and leave. Several heads turned. I felt the weight of the room. I felt the version of the story he'd been telling for years pressing in from all sides. And then Elliot stepped forward. I should tell you what Elliot does. He works for the Canada Border Services Agency, CBSA, as a senior investigative officer. He has spent the last 4 years working on financial fraud cases in British Columbia and Alberta, specifically in cases involving estate manipulation and elder financial abuse. He is very good at his job. He is also, as I mentioned, very quiet. He saves his words. He stepped forward and he said calmly to the room, "I think before this goes any further, it's worth noting that my wife is the named beneficiary on her mother's life insurance policy, has documentation to that effect, and any attempt to contest or misrepresent that is a matter that will be reviewed by the appropriate provincial authorities." Silence. My father stared at him. Elliot reached into his jacket pocket and produced a business card. CBSA, his name, his title. He held it out to my father's companion. The man took it with fingers that were not entirely steady. My father said, "This has nothing to do with." "The estate is also being reviewed," Elliot said. "Independently of today, that process has already begun." He paused. "I thought you should know that since we're all here." I watched my father's face. I had spent my childhood watching his face for the micro-expressions that told you what was really happening behind whatever he was performing for the room. I was very good at reading him. What I saw in that moment was fear. Not the kind of fear that looks like fear, the kind that looks like stillness. My aunt had appeared beside me. She was gripping my arm. A few of the older women in the room, women who had known my mother, who had perhaps known more than they'd ever said aloud, were watching my father with expressions I couldn't entirely read. My father said to the room, to no one, to everyone, "This is outrageous. This is a funeral." "It is," I agreed. "It's my mother's funeral. And I'm her daughter. And I'm not leaving." He looked at me for a long moment. And then, for the first time in my memory, he looked away first. He left the room. His companion followed him. I stood there and I breathed. The reception was quieter after that. My aunt stayed close to me. A few women approached me, carefully, with the cautious kindness of people who've been watching something from a distance for a long time and weren't sure it was their place to speak. One of them, a woman who'd been in my mother's quilting group, took both my hands and said simply, "She talked about you. All the time. Until the end. She talked about you." That unmade me a little. In the best way. The estate process took several months. There were complications. There were things my father had attempted that required legal untangling. The life insurance policy was straightforward. Sun Life had the original documentation and beneficiary designation, and his claims of altered mental capacity went nowhere. The broader estate was messier, but that's a longer story and not the one I came here to tell. What I came here to tell you is about that room, about standing in it, about my father looking away first. I want to be honest about what I felt, because I think the honest version is more useful than the satisfying version. I didn't feel triumphant. Not exactly. I felt something more like settled, like a thing that had been leaning against a wall for 11 years had finally been stood upright. It didn't undo what had been taken. It didn't give me back the last 18 months of my mother's life. It didn't give me back the driveway moment, or the unanswered calls, or the years of careful, rationed contact. But I had stood in that room as myself. Not the version of me he told everyone about, not the girl who had walked away, but the woman who had built something real, who had a husband who showed up with quiet competence, who had spent a year doing her homework and knew exactly what she was walking into. My mother had left me something, not just the policy. She'd left me, through her friend, a card, handwritten. I don't know when she wrote it. Sometime in the last year, clearly. The handwriting was shakier than I remembered. It said, "I should have waved. I'm sorry I didn't wave. I love you. I always did. I keep it in the drawer of my nightstand. Some nights I take it out and read it once and put it back." That's the part of the story I don't tell out loud very often. The rest of it, the estate, the CBSA badge, my father's face in that room, people find that satisfying. And I understand why. But the card is the part that actually changed something in me. The part that made it possible to close a door I'd been standing in the frame of for 11 years, half in and half out. I closed it gently. That felt important. She'd waved, in the end. Just 11 years late? There's a card in my nightstand drawer that I've read maybe 200 times. The handwriting is shaky. It says she's sorry she didn't wave. I think about cause and effect a lot. Not in any mystical sense, just in the plain, observable way that actions compound over time and eventually land somewhere. My father spent decades making choices, small ones and large ones. He chose to issue ultimatums instead of having conversations. He chose to build a version of the story where he was the wronged party. He chose to cut off my mother's phone in her final months. Every one of those choices narrowed the world around him, quietly. The way ice thins before it breaks. And he never noticed because he was too focused on controlling what was directly in front of him. What he didn't account for was 11 years of me. I didn't spend those years being angry, mostly. I spent them building something. I got my footing, then I got my career, then I found a person who paid attention when I talked and showed up when it mattered. I also, eventually, got a very clear-eyed understanding of what had actually happened to me and what I was owed. Not emotionally, but legally, practically, in documented fact. That clarity didn't come from bitterness. It came from deciding that I was going to be someone who did the work rather than someone who waited for things to be fair. That's the part I want to sit with for a moment, because I think it's the part that actually matters. There's a version of my story where I show up at that funeral unprepared, running purely on grief and old wounds, and my father talks over me and the room believes him, and I leave with nothing. That version existed as a possibility. What made it not happen wasn't luck. It was that I'd spent the better part of a year doing the quiet, unglamorous work of understanding my rights, gathering documentation and talking to people who knew what to do with it. Intelligence isn't just what you know in a flash of insight. It's what you build slowly, deliberately, when no one is watching and there's no immediate payoff. Elliot stepping forward in that room the way he did. That wasn't a surprise to anyone who knows him. He is exactly who he appears to be. That's its own kind of integrity. He didn't perform anything in that moment. He simply told the truth, clearly, in a room where the truth had been in short supply for a long time. I've thought about that a lot. About what it means to be someone whose word is simply solid. My father's entire strategy depended on being the most credible person in any given room. Elliot didn't argue with him. He just existed. with his actual credentials and his actual marriage and his actual knowledge of the file. And that was enough. Courage, I've learned, rarely looks like what you expect. It's not usually loud. It's showing up to a room where you know people believe a version of you that isn't true, and standing quietly in your own skin until the air shifts. It's saying no once, clearly, to someone who has counted on your compliance your whole life. It's making the decision to drive 2 hours east and walk through a door, not because you're sure of the outcome, but because your mother is gone and she was yours too. And you will not let someone else's narrative be the last word on that. My mother left me a card. She left me the truth of what she'd felt all along. Some things compound forward. The choices my father made narrowed his world until, in that funeral home, it cracked open in front of people who'd believed him for years. The choices I made opened mine, slowly, with a lot of quiet effort, until I could stand in that room with my husband beside me and say, I have documentation, I know my rights, and I'm not leaving. She waved. Just late. That's enough.